Hello, class. So this is Professor Suarez bringing you class number 3. And today we're going to discuss some very important subjects. We're discussing some ideas behind loans and why people gravitate towards them. Also, we talk about how we can increase our overall lifetime wealth and what may hinder us from doing that. So let's go ahead and get started. So income, as it's distributed throughout your life, follows a certain pattern. It's like a bell-shaped curve where it goes up in the beginning of your career and then goes down, right? So what's interesting about it is many people don't really take into account the fact that in the beginning of your life you make substantially less than what you would make once you establish your career, and then towards the end of your life you're making substantially less due to retirement and the inability to work, right? So first you get jobs before your college degree. These are usually minimum wage or low paying jobs or low skilled jobs, right? Then after you graduate, your income rises, and then also rises with your experience and what you bring to the table until it gets to a point where you peak out and you're not able to make any more than what you make at that time period, right? It's usually when you establish yourself in your field or your industry till finally your income declines due to retirement or technology replacing your jobs. And with this, type of lifestyle, right? Um, you may find that in the beginning of the time when you need the money, you don't have access to it, or you can't get it. Or later in life, when you're in retirement, you can make more money. You need access to funds that unfortunately you can't work to get, right? So that's where loans come in. Loans actually help you to even out the distribution of your income throughout your life. And they also help in a way to pay for the things that you can't afford either earlier in life. Some people tend to use borrowing for consumption, right? While others tend to use it to um, finance some of their dreams and aspirations and some of their work. Um, Whatever the case may be, uh, with regards to income life distribution, uh, this the loans that people have access to at different periods of their life allow them to live a more fulfilled life. So when do we use loans, right? And how can we use them to increase our cash flow? So to answer this question, we look at countries of poverty. Um, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with microloans, but they have become really popular in recent years to fund entrepreneurship in some poor third world countries, right? And a lot of the research associated with these microloans tend to lean in favor of helping entrepreneurs in third world countries to really get on their feet and give them the resources to buy a goat, right? Because a goat is the difference between life and death, because they could use the goat milk, right, to feed their kids or to take care of themselves. But the reality is, for a lot of these microloans, they tend to be very expensive, in some cases reaching up to 100% in interest. Um, so in cases in third world countries where the income, people are making $1 a day in some cases, it's giving them a loan with 100% interest to start a business that potentially won't make as much money to be able to pay back the loans. It seems a bit counterintuitive, right? Um, but many people find that this is a way to help a lot of these entrepreneurs get back on their feet, while at the same time making a reasonable profit considering the risk and also helping other people. But the reality is, loans that are taken out by a lot of these people in third world countries, are used for consumption. Like they'll use it to pay for a wedding, or they'll use it to pay for some regular expense like clothing, or splurge on some kind of aspect of life that they probably wouldn't be able to afford under normal circumstances. And this really kind of puts in perspective that the fact that loans only work if they're utilized with other aspects of the economy that we have as a wealthy and rich nation can take advantage of, right? But mind you, we don't have to worry about taking out microloans and being entrepreneurial. We could go ahead and take jobs at corporations and different businesses that will help pay and finance for the things that we want out of life. In these third world countries, they have to be extremely entrepreneurial. They have to find ways to make money because it's a matter of life and death. That's not the case for us, right? So with regards to taking out loans, we also have the ability to make choices about the loans we take. So the book gives a couple examples of the different kind of loans we have access to, right? We have inexpensive loans, which are loans from family members, friends, people who don't necessarily charge us interest, right? Medium price loans, which are from credit unions or organizations that are dedicated to building credit, right? And then you have expensive loans, which are the ones that are convenient and have an open time frame, like they're rolling credit cards, right? That and also have higher risk because they're not tied to anything. They're not collateralized like an auto loan or a mortgage, right? So all these aspects allow us to make choices that benefit us and benefit the opportunities that are available to us. And aside from just thinking about, using loans to buy sneakers or buy a new outfit or taking out an expensive auto loan to buy a new car, right? You have to take into account that a lot of these things may not add value to our lives as far as or as much as a business opportunity, an investment, or putting it into developing your human capital, right? And when you look at these poor countries and what they're really missing to really build on their entrepreneurship are the institutions that we have access to. Honestly, few people borrow for entrepreneurial endeavors or aspects that help to improve income or human capital. Student loans are actually one of the most common loans issued, and they're probably the best ones because they are that investment in human capital. So we're talking about how wealth is distributed, right? And we talked briefly about income distribution over time. But when you look at the amount of work that goes into producing corporations and businesses in the United States, right? And you see billionaires like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, unfortunately, may he rest in peace. You think to yourself, well, if I come up with a good idea and I put enough work and effort into it, I should become a millionaire, right? Just because it's an entrepreneurial concept, right? And it's strange because, like I said before, in these third world countries, you have people that it's life and death for them. They're way more entrepreneurial than we are in the United States. So why is it that there's not more millionaires in those third world countries when they have a brilliant idea? And it's because of the institutions and the aspects that we can take advantage of. For example, like we have colleges, university, and education system that turns out some of the top scientists, engineers, and managers in the entire world. People look to hire United States graduates, right?
The other aspect too, we have financial institutions that really help to fund some of our ideas. And then the other aspect to take into account is the more complicated a lot of these ideas get, and a lot of these elaborate plans and corporations become, the more open it tends to be. For example, take Google, that gives a lot of people outside of their company access to the information and the tools and resources that they personally use to develop products, right? Now, the other thing to take into account is income inequality, right? So there's economics index known as the Gini index, which measures the amount of inequality in a given area. And what's great about this is you could take the Gini index for a block, a city, a state, whatever, right? And one detail that I noticed is the highest paid graduates are actually in the places with the highest amount of inequality, right? And this may have to do with the fact that there's something known as price law. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Pareto principle, but it's also referred to as the Matthew principle. Those who have much will be given more, and those who have less it'll be taken away. This is from the Bible, right? Well, the Pareto principle goes something like 80% of the wealth resides with 20% of the population, right? And vice versa. Well, there's another principle known as Price's law. This is based on a study of master's or doctoral thesis done by a program, and the Professor Price, noticed that the square root of the amount of people in the master's or doctoral program wrote 50% of all the theses in that program, right? And this didn't just apply to just theses, this also applied to the workload in companies and corporations, meaning that if you had 100 employees, the square root of that amount would do 50% of the work. So you had 10,000 employees, then 100 employees would be doing half of the work. And as you grew bigger and bigger, it'd be the same thing, which refers to a very curious case of how work and efficiency in a company grows linearly as the population grows in your company, but it also denotes that incompetence and negligence grows exponentially as your company grows, right? Which also begs the question, how much are these people getting paid? If you have 100 employees and 10 employees do 50% of the work, how valuable are they to your company? Probably very valuable, right? And this goes back to another principle in economics where the market sets the demand, and they set the price based on demand. So you have, for example, you have lawyers who are paid $400 an hour, corporate lawyers, right? But these people are on call nearly 24/7. If a client from California calls you at 3 a.m. and they want to answer to a very complicated question, if they're paying you $400 an hour, they want that answer right now, and they want you to answer it to the best of your ability. And there's people who take up those jobs, people who work 80-hour work weeks, who have gone to Harvard Law School or Yale or Princeton and have put the time and effort into their career to be that expert. But again, it's a lot of work. It's very competitive. You have to push beyond, the regular hours that a person would work to get to that point, right? And, the aspect that kind of gets confusing and a bit inundated is where people say, oh, the reason that, white people or people who have multiple generations here are wealthy is because they have access to wealth, and minorities and blacks haven't had that much time. But the reality is it has little to do with race or even gender, right? And playing the victimization or playing the victim and saying, you know what, we'll only have the opportunity to do so when there's laws that are, there's equal rights, and we have more equality in the country. To be honest, we're one of the most equal countries as far as rights and opportunities, right? Um, sure, the income inequality is tremendous. I mean, we have the highest income inequality as far as some of the wealthiest nations, but unfortunately, naturally, income tends to go to the wealthy, and it's we still have to negotiate with that, right? Then you have aspects like the corruption index, which kind of indicate whether or not the country that you operate in is corrupt. So in places like Latin America, you know, they have a pretty high corruption index. And the reason is historically, the colonies that were established in Latin America were established to go in and take out all the wealth, and they've built on that concept, right? So there's a lot of corruption. It's very difficult to get a business set up in, for example, Peru, where the laws and the bureaucraticness makes it even difficult to buy a house, or buy a place to have business, right? Brazil is probably the exception because Brazil is one of the quickest emerging markets in Latin America. But again, they didn't have to fight for their freedom. They were ran by the Prince of Portugal, and he decided, you know what, Brazil wants to have its independence, so they were able to get it. America, on the other hand, we have a very low corruption index in a lot of our states. So again, for people to say or to play the victim or play race politics and say, you know what, yeah, or even play class politics and to say, you know what, like the rich and the wealthy have set up a system to make the poor poor. That's not the case. A lot of these people, and I mean, I have people that I know personally have worked their entire lives to develop the wealth that they have. Um, so setting a self-defeatist attitude, it's not going to benefit anybody. It's definitely not going to benefit you. The other thing to take into account that poverty existed since the beginning of time. If you think back to when we were in loincloths and in hunter and gatherer societies, we had to deal with the fact that we were poor. We didn't have iPhones. We didn't have technology. We had to invent spears and bows and arrows and agriculture. And the world was rough. It was crazy. Like there was woolly mammoths and lions that we had to fend off. We are very fortunate that in our day and age we don't have to deal with those things. Well, our collectives and technology and institutions have allowed us to have a better quality of life. So compared to the rest of the world, we're pretty well off. But again, if you have a drive to be wealthy, if you have a drive to be more affluent, you have to take into account that the institutions that are set up, colleges, universities, financial institutions, government, technology, you have to be able to learn how to access these things in such a way that it makes you an expert or it makes you valuable to these people, right? So why are people poor? And this is probably a difficult concept for some people to understand because in their experience, they probably have felt like the world is against them, right? Or the world is against their people. Because the narrative that's being told is, there's systemic racism, so the opportunities are different for a white person than it is for a black person, or for an Asian person, or for a Japanese person, or an Iranian, whatever, right? Or there's a class warfare where the upper class have set it up so that way the middle class is receding, or the poor, working class don't have access to the same opportunities as a white person or a wealthy person, right? But the problem is the question of income is a multivariate problem, which is just a complicated way of saying that there's a lot of aspects that go into how much income a person is going to make. And maybe a small percentage of that is background or race. But I guarantee you that a greater portion of that is personal temperament and what they choose to study. It's not a race issue. And like I said before, there are people who would like to play the victim and say this is I'm poor or I'm in this situation because of white people or because of Republicans or because of a lack of support, right? But in the previous slides, I pointed out to the fact that we have some of the best institutions in the country, right? And in the world, really. And we have the opportunities to make more money because we have access to loans, we have access to financial institutions, to technology, right? And that gives us an edge on everybody else in the world that most people would die to have. Aside from that, sure, maybe there is some racism in the world. I would question whether or not there's systemic racism, and it's to the point where nobody or no blacks can make it, or no minorities can make it, or no working class people can make it, right? Because fact of the matter is that's not the reality. Perhaps you in your life, you might have experienced some racism, and I'm sorry if that was the case, but to say it's to the degree that our ancestors faced, where they were slaves, right? Or they had Jim Crow laws. That's not the case in America. The other aspect that I think is important in establishing is that these victims also benefit from this narrative, right? Let's take into account that there's something known as the welfare state, right? And the welfare state is any type of incentive or government stipend or tax deduction that's given to people who are unemployed or have a disability or may not want to work, right? The welfare state is designed to help people who are struggling that may need a little more income until they could find something to get back on their feet. But what it also does, unfortunately, the effect is it incentivizes not working. And I say this because there are people out there who collect on unemployment or collect on certain benefits or grants, right? Knowing that they have the ability and capacity to work, right? But instead of working, they choose to collect. They choose to cash in their check, right? And it incentivizes a dependence on other people's product, on other people's human capital, instead of developing their own human capital. Thomas Sowell has a great quote where he says, receiving products of other people's human capital is by no means as fundamental as developing one's own human capital. And what this means is true wealth is what's between people's ears. It's who knows how to farm. It's who knows how to develop computer programs, hardware, engineering, who knows how to fly a plane. It's skill sets that really develop wealth, right? And another example of how race is not a factor in the large scale about how wealth is developed in the United States. Take into account that in the 1940s, 80% of black people were in poverty, right? By the 1960s, that number had dropped down to 47% before the civil rights movement. And then in 1980s, it went to 31%. So even before the civil rights movement had occurred, poverty in the black community was already going down. It was in a downward trend. So then the civil rights movement came in, and then the welfare movement came in to help the impoverished community and give them some subsidies and some help in the form of food stamps, welfare benefits, and income tax, right? And single parent families now didn't have to be married to another person. They could get married to the government, and they could get their checks from there. But again, it doesn't incentivize work. It incentivizes victimization, right? And it's a dangerous place to be in. It's a very dangerous place to be in. But these are the people that are going to continue to be poor. So unfortunately, if you're in this situation, or if you know people in this situation, I think the best advice to give them is to get back to work and start to develop your craft, your skill. And if you're not in that position, then you're better than 80% of the population already. So it's important to take into account that there are no free lunches, right? And the reason I bring this up is it's because, as you know, in the previous election, there was a lot of politicians and policies that were attempted to be put in place with the intent of giving back to those who are most marginalized, the students, or the undocumented workers, or the families of undocumented people, the dreamers, right? But the reality is, nothing is free. There's a cost to everything, right? And the moment you make it free, the moment you make anything free, you are saying that you are entitled to free labor, right? Which is what? Slavery, right? Think about it for a second, right? Free markets exist because of the limitations we set, which allow businesses to flourish. Yes, market demands what it wants, and the government should let markets naturally reach equilibrium. But many of the policies that allow free markets to exist are based on laws and limitations. Take, for example, the most common example is child labor laws, right? So obviously everybody agrees that children should not be allowed to work, right? But back in the day, companies benefited greatly from child labor because it was cheap form of labor, and these children were able to bring income to their families, right? So both people benefited, supposedly. But what was happening was the government at that time felt that it was inappropriate to have children working long hours, in most cases in dangerous circumstances that compromised their health, and felt that it was more important to develop an education system to develop their minds and build their potential to be better citizens and be contributing citizens, right? So, the consent of the children and the ability to consent of the children trumped the importance of industrializing and the entrepreneurial capacity of these businesses, right? To be able to hire what they want. So the children's rights trump the businesses' rights, and rightfully so. But a free market, quote unquote free market, would argue that businesses should be allowed to do what they want, because the priority is to grow businesses and to to grow industries and to create more products. But the reality is, a free market can't exist without child labor, right? So this is an extreme example, but there are other limitations that are associated with a free market, right? And that's kind of the market that we try to operate in as Americans. We try to operate in free market economics like NAFTA, right? Where you could trade across different country boundaries and not have the limitations and the boundaries that were used to be associated with trades. But for those aspects, aside from how they affect our market, there's people that would like free education or free healthcare. But again, in order to have these things, there are limitations, right? So free education would mean that, and free healthcare would mean that you're entitled to the labor of professors for free, or the labor of doctors or nurse practitioners for free, right? Because if you didn't want to pay for it, who's going to pay for it? Somebody has to pay for it. And if nobody's paying for it, then the labor is free. And that would diminish the value of the education, bachelor's degree, master's degree that these professors get, as well as the doctorate degrees that a lot of these doctors and even some of these registered nurses get. So the reality is there are no free lunches, and by stating that this is something that's important, that needs to be pushed forward, it is going to inadvertently reduce the value of the degree that you are taking out so many loans for. Simply put, if the government gets involved, it's probably not going to work out. So less government is better in most cases. In free market economies, the government has to get involved because it's such a big endeavor. And in some cases, like, for example, South Korea, which famously and successfully mandated that LG got into technology, right? These cases showed exceptions to where the government did a great job in setting up different policies. So what I'm trying to say is, as far as the freeness that goes along with labor, that's wrong. And feeling entitled and saying that I have a right to education, I have a right to health care, that's not a right, it's a privilege. We have the privilege in America to be able to take advantage of these things, and that in itself makes us wealthier than a lot of other nations, and a lot better than other nations. But we don't want to diminish the value of what we earn here by requiring that our government gets involved as far as welfare and educate and making free education and free healthcare an aspect of that everybody is entitled to. When the reality is that it's not something that everyone's entitled to. It's earned and to some degree, I would imagine that it would be great that everybody is able to get health care, but we have to also prioritize our resources because it's limited, not to say that there are people out there that should die. What I'm saying is we need to be able to produce. People have to work. People have to earn their keep and earn their share, because the moment that people stop working and stop earning and stop developing new ideas is the moment that we stagnate and we lose the wealth that we've worked so hard to develop.
So something very important to understand, the market puts the price on discrimination. What I mean by that is the same way that the market makes its demand and sets its price based on the equilibrium of supply and demand, discrimination has its price. So in general, we discriminate, right? And the main way that we discriminate as far as the market's concerned is between talented workers and non-talented workers. So take, for example, the case of a surgeon. You wouldn't want somebody who cut class and didn't do their assignments and didn't put in the time in medical school to operate on your brain. You want somebody who's skilled and knows exactly what they're doing. So we have to discriminate between those two kinds of people. And the industry itself discriminates, but there's a price to it. There's a price to discrimination. Take, for example, again, a utility company that hires all Scandinavians, right? So Scandinavians tend to be paid more than most Europeans, and most Europeans tend to be paid more than most Americans, right? So for a nonprofit utility company, right, that hires all Scandinavians, who do you think is going to front the cost? It's going to be fronted to the customers, right? Because if it's an electric company, they're not going to eat the cost themselves. Like, you got what I'm saying? Like, it's going to come to us because we use the electricity and we pay for it, right? But there's no advantage or disadvantage to discrimination. They're able to do it and to fund it, but in competitive markets, it doesn't pay to discriminate. In fact, most competitive markets tend to be open. Take, for example, Google. Google gives all their resources and tools out to people who don't even work for the company. So there's a price to the discrimination, right? In another case, if you look at the NBA or in the NFL, if they had discriminated against blacks, they would have lost a lot of their star players and star athletes. But there was a time in back before the civil rights movement that the NFL refused to hire black people, and some of the best running backs were black at that time. But only the Redskins, for example, they didn't want to do it. But it only got to the point where they kept losing, where they decided, you know what, we're gonna go against what I guess their values were and hire black people. And I laugh about it, but the reality is there are people out there who have this rhetoric and are saying, there's systemic racism and we don't have access to the same opportunities. So we would like to have we would like to bring back affirmative actions, but there's an effect to it, right? Affirmative action was a law that was instated where they had quotas for how many people were hired based on race and ethnicity. And in some cases, they were hired only on the basis of race and ethnicity, where people who were legitimately qualified for the job weren't hired, where white people were legitimately not hired because they were white. And then this kind of set up the field for reverse racism. So, you traded one racism for another kind of racism. And, this conversation keeps happening where, people say blacks don't have access to the same opportunities as whites. But I would challenge that. In again, because the reality is in competitive industries where you need to have the best and most talented people, right? You need to have access to all kinds of people, white, black, Asian, Middle Eastern, whoever, right? Because you need to have the best and most talented people. And you're not going to do that by being discriminatory. You're not going to do that by being racist. So, again, there's a cost to it too, to be discriminatory and to really separate yourself and say, you know what, we want to have all these kind of people or all those kind of people. No, companies won't do that because it's not cost effective and it doesn't reflect the reality of what's going on.
sure, maybe again, some of us have experienced some racism in our life, and that's unfortunate. And I do apologize about that. But to say that all companies are racist or America is racist is detrimental to yourself, because you're not giving yourself access to the valuable assets and institutions and processes that are available to you, because you feel like it would be useless based on your race and ethnicity. You're having a defeatist attitude, and that's not going to benefit you or anybody else that's around you. Mind you, I bring this, I defend America, I defend what we have access to, and some of you might feel that I'm defending the inequality that exists as a natural part of life, right? But it's not. Inequality is a problem. Um, Places with high Gini indexes tend to have lower life expectancy and tend to have lower quality healthcare. Um, why? That's not directly. I mean, it's not directly correlated to income inequality, but that tends to be the case, and people tend to die sooner. And it's a higher mortality rate, right? Higher crime rate too in income inequal areas. But to try to enforce it with socialist policies or blanket statements and say, you know what, we have to take from the rich to feed the poor, it's the wrong way to go about it. Equality of outcome is hard to enforce, and it would require stealing and forcing labor from the most talented individuals, which I can tell you didn't work in Cuba, didn't work in USSR, and didn't work in any other socialist government. Um, so it's important to take into account our most important value and our most important and most valuable asset, which is our time. And our time, we can't take it back. So by making efforts to improve our own life and our own capacity first, that allows us the opportunity to improve the outcome of the lives of others and those around us. Um, so it's important to take into account where we spend our time and how we spend our time. So with that being said, I hope you guys are able to take this information and really use it to reinforce what you're learning in this class. If you have any questions or any comments about what I said, whether you agree or disagree, feel free to contact me and get in touch with me at your earliest convenience. Again, this is Professor Suarez giving you a personal finance lesson. Thank you so much for your time, and take care.